Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, I want you to imagine being just 20 years old. You know, it's an age usually defined by uncertainty. You're just standing at the threshold of adulthood, kind of trying to map out a vague future. But imagine that by your 20th birthday, the psychological weight of an entire fractured kingdom has already been dropped squarely on your shoulders. You haven't just inherited a volatile throne. You've literally dismantled a massive rebellion. And now? Now you're actively mobilizing an army to invade the wealthiest, most formidable superpower on the face of the earth. This isn't some crazy historical fiction. This was the actual waking reality for a young man from the ancient Mediterranean named Alexander. Today we're going to explore exactly how a boy, engineered for conquest and burdened with almost unimaginable expectations, became the defining military architect of the ancient world.
Okay, let's dive into this. To genuinely understand the wild environment that produced Alexander, we first need to travel back more than 2,300 years to a super volatile, shifting geopolitical climate. And it forces us to ask a really fundamental question. What happens when superpowers bleed each other dry? You see, the ancient Greece of the 4th century BC wasn't a single, cohesive nation with a unified identity. Not at all. Following a series of absolutely devastating conflicts, it had become this bitter, fragmented region. A massive power vacuum had opened up, leaving dozens of fiercely independent city-states locked in a perpetual struggle for dominance. They were deeply suspicious of each other, heavily armed, and constantly maneuvering for literally any possible tactical advantage over their neighbors.
These distinct superpower identities really underscored the severity of their divisions. On one hand, you have Athens, right? Renowned for its philosophical foundations and democratic institutions, commanding the seas with these powerful fleets operating out of gorgeous marble-lined harbors. Contrast that with Sparta, whose heavily armored, hyper-disciplined warriors literally cast a shadow of fear across the known world. And emerging right alongside them was Thebes, a formidable military innovator in its own right. But rather than forging a unified Hellenic coalition, these states treated diplomacy as a zero-sum game. They were basically caught in the devastating, century-long hangover of the Peloponnesian War. Sparta's victory over Athens proved notoriously short-lived, which only led to more resentment. Then, out of nowhere, Thebes shocked the world by shattering Spartan invincibility at the Battle of Leuctra. These endless, brutal rivalries, we're talking phalanx crashing against phalanx in the dust, severely depleted their treasuries and their manpower, utterly blinding them to the threats gathering just beyond their borders.
So the absolutely crucial point here is what was transpiring while the dominant Greek powers were entirely consumed by their own internal rivalries. While Athens, Sparta, and Thebes were locked in this vicious cycle of mutual destruction, a peripheral kingdom to the north was methodically consolidating its strength. That kingdom was Macedonia. Now, the self-described sophisticated Greeks of the south held a deeply entrenched prejudice against the Macedonians. They pretty much viewed them as a fringe, semi-barbaric society, lacking the democratic institutions, the philosophical refinement, and the cultural pedigree of true Hellenes. But this aristocratic arrogance, it proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. By dismissing Macedonia as a land of mere farmers and highlanders, the southern Greeks made one fatal mistake. They completely underestimated the rising storm to their north.
And let me tell you, the shift in power wasn't gradual at all. It was more like a sudden, violent whiplash. In just a couple of decades, the entire geopolitical structure of the Aegean was rewritten. It begins in 359 BC when a visionary tactician named King Philip II secures the Macedonian throne. A mere 3 years later, in 356 BC, a prince named Alexander is born into this rapidly expanding court. And by 338 BC, this aggressive expansion culminates at the explosive Battle of Chaeronea. This compressed era of transformation really anchors our story. In a remarkably short window, a peripheral state maneuvered itself to the center of the world stage, setting off a sequence of events that would permanently alter human history.
Let's examine that pivotal first milestone, 359 BC, the year King Philip II ascended to power. Philip was a brilliant, battle-scarred statesman who possessed an extraordinary geopolitical cunning. He didn't just inherit an underdog kingdom, he fundamentally reconstructed it from the ground up. Recognizing that Macedonia was surrounded by enemies, Philip first secured his vulnerable borders through a masterful blend of ruthless military action and calculated diplomacy. Crucially, he seized control of the highly lucrative gold and silver mines of Mount Pangaeum. That provided the vast financial resources required to fund his ambitions. He looked at those divided, exhausted Greek armies to his south, recognized their tactical stagnation, and knew precisely how to exploit their vulnerabilities.
To execute this massive vision, Philip orchestrated a complete military revolution. He transformed what was essentially a seasonal militia of peasant farmers into a professional, full-time standing army, subjecting them to the most grueling physical and tactical training regimen in all of Greece. But his true genius lay in tactical innovation. Philip perfected the highly sophisticated hammer and anvil tactic. This required seamlessly synchronizing a highly disciplined infantry, the anvil, with incredibly fast-moving, devastating heavy cavalry strikes, the hammer. While the traditional Greek city-states remained stubbornly attached to their exhausting, kind of archaic methods of warfare, Philip forged a dynamic, interdependent modern military machine capable of adapting to any threat on the battlefield.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the linchpin of Philip's new army, the sarissa. This was an unprecedented weapon that fundamentally changed the physics of ancient warfare. Extending up to 18 feet in length, 18 feet. It was significantly longer than the traditional spears carried by southern Greek hoplites. Because of its massive size, the sarissa required a soldier to use both hands to wield it effectively, necessitating a specialized, much smaller shield strapped directly to the shoulder. When thousands of Macedonian infantrymen marched in perfect, synchronized formation with these towering pikes leveled at the enemy, they created a lethal, impenetrable, bristling wall. It allowed the Macedonian phalanx to dominate the battlefield and strike their opponents from a distance that traditional Greek infantry simply could not penetrate.
This modernized military engine finally met its ultimate test in 338 BC at the Battle of Chaeronea. This clash wasn't just another regional skirmish. It carried immense historical weight. It was the definitive end of the independent classical Greek city-states. Facing a coalition led by Athens and Thebes, Philip unleashed his coordinated infantry and cavalry strikes, methodically dismantling the allied Greek forces. Remember those ancient rivalries we discussed earlier? The endless squabbles that had plagued the Aegean for over a century? Well, they were permanently silenced that day by a unified Macedonian fist. With this decisive victory, Philip II emerged as the undisputed hegemon of Greece. The marginalized kingdom of the north had actually conquered the cultural epicenter of the world.
But, ruling Greece was merely a stepping stone for Philip. While his reality was cementing control over the Aegean Peninsula, his ultimate ambition lay far, far to the east. Philip dreamed of launching a monumental invasion against the mighty Persian Empire. This wasn't merely about expanding borders, it was framed as a grand crusade of retribution for the Greco-Persian wars of the previous century, and maybe more pragmatically, a chance to seize the immense, almost unfathomable wealth of the Persian treasury. He intended to lead a unified Hellenic army to conquer the largest empire on earth. Yet, history is notoriously unpredictable. Philip's life would be cut short by an assassin's blade, leaving this colossal, unrealized dream to be inherited by his chosen heir.
While Philip was systematically redrawing the political map of Greece, an even more consequential event had actually already occurred back in the Macedonian capital of Pella. We shift our focus back to the year 356 BC, deep inside the royal quarters of the palace. Here, a prince was born to King Philip and his formidable wife, Princess Olympias of Epirus. This child was Alexander. From the very moment of his arrival, the narrative surrounding his life was carefully constructed to suggest that an individual of monumental destiny had entered the world, a child inextricably tied to greatness and divine favor.
The circumstances of Alexander's birth are deeply, deeply intertwined with historical mythology. Ancient writers frequently noted that on the exact night he was born, violent electrical storms lashed the region, and across the Aegean, the magnificent temple of Artemis at Ephesus burned to the ground. Now, while a savvy modern audience can recognize these cosmic signs as brilliant propaganda, narratives heavily promoted by Alexander and his historians later in life to solidify his divine right to rule, they highlight something absolutely essential about his legacy. The deliberate myth-making illustrates a fundamental belief that Alexander was not a mere mortal king, but a profound force of nature destined to irrevocably alter the course of human events.
Alexander was quite literally engineered for conquest. Raised in a deeply intense, honestly almost toxic psychological environment, his development was torn between the polarizing influences of his powerful parents. His mother, Olympias, a woman of fierce ambition and mystical inclinations, filled his young mind with epic poetry, convincing him he was a direct descendant of the mythical hero Achilles, destined for divine glory. Conversely, his pragmatic, battle-hardened father, Philip, grounded the prince in brutal realities. He imparted the unforgiving lessons of statecraft, teaching his son that maintaining a kingdom requires ruthless courage, ironclad discipline, and relentless ambition. This intense dichotomy forged a young man of unparalleled drive and brilliant tactical intuition.
And the historical impact of these lessons is just staggering. By the time Alexander reached the age of 32, an age where most modern professionals are, only just establishing their careers, he hadn't just fulfilled his father's grand ambition, he had entirely eclipsed it.
He would command armies that swept eastward, dismantling the vast Persian superpower, and ultimately forging an empire of unprecedented scale that stretched continuously from the shores of Greece down into the heart of Egypt and deep into the frontiers of India. In slightly over a decade of campaigning, he became the undisputed master of the known world.
Which brings us to the threshold of his legendary campaign, leaving us with a truly thrilling historical inquiry. How exactly does a young prince, burdened with these monumental expectations, forged by a volatile royal household and handed a revolutionary military machine, go on to unravel the greatest empire on earth? The foundations have definitely been laid, but his intellectual arsenal is about to be sharpened. Soon this intense young heir will be placed under the tutelage of Aristotle, the greatest philosophical mind of the ancient world. So, how does a boy forged by war and tutored by genius go on to conquer the globe? Well, you won't want to miss the tactical brilliance and sheer audacity of what unfolds next as we continue analyzing his extraordinary rise.